Mara asked if we were bringing snacks, and I said no, and she was really worried because she said nobody comes to things like this unless there are snacks. So I'm glad you guys showed up. But I'm so excited to be able to introduce you to Mara Abbott. Mara first came to Whitman in 2004 as a student and a swimmer, competing for the varsity swim team through her senior year. But what she did in her off-season began to take the spotlight. Mara joined the cycling team and ended up winning the collegiate national championships that year, following it up by 10 more collegiate cycling national titles. Mara turned professional while still at Whitman, and in her second year as a professional rider, she won the U.S. Elite National Road Race Championships. Mara continued to win some of the biggest races on the world circuit, topping in 2010 by being the first American woman to win the Giro Rosa, the most prestigious women's race in the world. Mara came back to defend that title by again winning the Giro Rosa in 2013. On top of her cycling accolades, Mara is an avid environmentalist, serving her hometown of Boulder on the city's environmental advisory board, as well as being passionate about her practice of yoga and as a certified yoga instructor. So you're all here to hear Mara talk, so I'll let her talk, but help me in welcoming Mara Abbott.
All right, well, again, thank you guys all so much for coming. So I'll start with a little story. So last spring, in 2013, I called my coach, Dean, from a race to tell him how grateful I felt. And it wasn't because I was making a comeback to the sport after a year and a half off. And it wasn't because I was leading the race, even though both of those things were true. I was calling Dean in gratitude because there had been a big crash, and I had gone down in it. See, if you ride bikes long enough, you start to learn that there can be a big crash in a race, you can go down, and somehow you can get back up, and you can catch back up even when you don't want to, and you can still even win the race. And those sorts of things seem so improbable that you aren't really going to believe them unless they happen. And so I was happy because I knew that that embodied knowledge that I could get back up and still win a race through that adversity. San Dimas, the race I was at, it was a little race. But I knew if the comeback was actually going to go anywhere, there were going to be bigger races. And that I was going to need that ability to return. And I said to my coach, and I told this to my coach, Dean, and of course his reaction, he's the guru, he's unflappable, and he just says, awesome, that's great, glad to hear it. So Dean and my celebration was because I'd been able to be reminded of my resilience. And that's what I'm going to talk to you, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. I know that we all in our bike kits look super glamorous with our padded shorts and our skinny arms. But the importance of resilience in my career as a bike racer is something that extends to anyone who's trying to make something of themselves in this world. We all want to have careers and legacies that endure. Not even Vanilla Ice wanted to be a one-hit wonder. So for the note takers out there, I've divided this into 5 principles. They're my 5 principles of resilience. Resilience is the ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And that sounds pretty good. It's pretty hard to argue with that. And so the question becomes exactly how. And here's my prescription for honing your resilience. Principle 1, do not allow yourself to be defined by your past failures. So I alluded in my opening story to the fact that I took time off from the sport of cycling. And the reason that I've taken that off goes a little bit deeper. I come straight out of Whitman, and I basically had this dream career trajectory. I won an elite national championship. I signed a contract with the biggest team in the world. I went on to win the Giro Rosa, the Giro Donna at the time, which is basically our equivalent of the Tour de France, at least prestige-wise. And so from the outside, that looks pretty good. Unfortunately, there was a part of me that was unsettled with what I was doing and didn't feel like I was making a real or quantifiable impact on the world. And regardless of whether that's true, the problem was that I wasn't able to say it. Because if you have this, you're the great white hope. You have the career path that everyone wants, and you can't really sit there and say, oh, sorry guys, I'm not really comfortable with this. I mean, I'm not sure if this is actually what I want to be doing. Because in my mind, no one really wanted to hear that. And so I wanted a way out at the time, and my way of getting out was showing it instead of saying it. And so I actually developed a bit of an eating disorder. I was unsure of my value, and I didn't have anyone to confide that to, and so I sort of let myself disappear physically. And I kept waiting as I got weaker and less effective on the bike, because that's something interesting. I think a lot of people look at endurance athletics, and an eating disorder is a way to boost your performance. It's a way to make yourself stronger and faster because you're lighter. And in my case, I knew exactly how destructive I was being. I mean, this is actually with hindsight, but the point was to allow myself an exit door. And I kept waiting for someone to say, you don't look very happy. Do you want out of this? And no one said it. And so I ended up having to quit myself in the summer of 2011. And this was my first broken heart, the way I like to look at it. So this cycling was my fancy boyfriend, and we'd been together for a long time, and we'd done, he'd given me all this notoriety. But ultimately, we broke up, and I was brokenhearted, and I spent a year and a half literally couldn't hang out with our mutual friends. I didn't talk to anyone from cycling world. But at the end of that time, I started to get some inklings, and ultimately, I realized I wanted to be racing again, and then I missed it. And that I wanted to get back together again with cycling. Now, this phase of my life is not exactly what I would consider one of my greatest successes. But I want to be precise when I use the word failure and the word eating disorder, or the words eating disorder, in the same context. Actually, what I would like to do is fully destigmatize the idea of failure. And I would define it as a process, rather than as a state of being, or as a judgment. Success is one thing and failure is another, and they complement each other. They can't exist without another. Your failures are followed by successes, and your successes are made greater by your failures. Basically, just because I screwed up, that did not make me a screw-up. I let a lot of people down, and I probably took years off my mother's life in the process. But I made it through, and that means that even though I had a failure in my life, I am not one of them. So when I went to go and make my comeback, the first thing that I had to do was admit that I was wrong. Because when I left the sport, a lot of people said, oh, congratulations on your retirement. And I felt the need to correct them and say, I did not retire, I quit. And so then I had to go back and say, actually, to all the people that I had told them with utter confidence that no, they were wrong, I was never going to race a bike again, I had to tell them that I was wrong, and then I wanted to come back. And that goes back to the relationship analogy. Because often in a relationship, in order to heal the relationship, the first thing that you have to do is admit that you're wrong. And the second thing I had to do, which is perhaps even more difficult, was I had to let go of my old self, or my old image of myself. Because I had to let go of the image of a person who wasn't strong enough, who couldn't accelerate well enough, who didn't belong there, who wasn't doing anything important. Before I could be a bike racer again, I had to let go of that image, or it just didn't make sense. I made a deal with myself that if I was going to come back, I was going to have to be fully honest. Because I still didn't know what my value was as a cyclist. And I use this actually now as my Twitter bio, but the phrase is, my comparative advantage lies in kicking ass. And if you guys have taken an econ class, comparative advantage is my advantage over all the other people in the world. So this is what my greatest good that I can contribute to society. And so the joke I make with myself is that for whatever reason, my comparative advantage is riding bikes fast. And I'm not sure yet what societal good that confers, but I'm just going to trust that something good is happening out there. But in order to allow myself to come back to the sport and to indulge in this career that just seemed like having fun, I realized that I was going to have to be honest. Because if the story of my eating disorder could benefit someone, for me to keep it a secret meant that I was taking away some of the little purpose of my career. And so I did a big article in a magazine called Velo News. And it was sort of my tell-all story. And the great part about that was it meant that everyone knew. And there was no drama, no one talking behind your back, no worrying about people creating their own impressions, because I got to tell the story. And in doing so, I got to release that past failure and make it not such a big deal. Because realistically, we will all fail. Far likely, more often than we will succeed. And in this sense, I crashed figuratively, pretty hard. But the failures and the crashes don't matter so much as long as we allow ourselves to be resilient. Now, it seems pretty easy to say that you don't want to let yourself be defined by failure. I think, that doesn't take a very big leap. But I want to challenge you a little bit more with principle 2. Do not allow yourself to be defined by your past successes. So I want you now to close your eyes, and I want you to visualize something that you have done that you are so proud of. One of your greatest accomplishments. And now I want you to let it go. Because it can't be who you are forever. I've accomplished a lot of things in my career that I'm proud of, but I really like to hope that my best isn't over yet. And I feel that the second that you cut yourself off to saying that this is my best, I've had this success is who I am, then you're cut off to evolution. I'm going to make an attempt here at a pop culture reference, which is not my forte. We're going to talk about Bill Gates. And I don't really know a lot about computers, but Bill Gates did. And he invented a lot of things with them. And I believe he went on to become one of the richest, I think the richest man in the world for a while. And so you're saying, okay, this guy changed the entire face of technology, and he became the richest man in the world. And I think if he had stopped there, we probably would have still been pretty impressed with him. But rather than sitting there and saying that that success was enough, he goes on to create this foundation with his wife, which provides scholarships, which creates humanitarian aid that influences the lives of, I would suspect, millions of people. And so if he had been satisfied with his computer career, none of that would have happened. For myself, I have people who come to me as a cyclist and they say, I admire you so much. You are the best climber in the world. Which is awesome, and it's a huge compliment. And whether or not it's true is a matter of today or tomorrow, but the point is, as a cyclist, being a climber is a fairly specialized role, because that means when it gets really windy, or the descents get technical, or it's a lot of power climbing and up and down, you actually become a little bit more of a liability than an asset. And so, for me to say, yes, I'm the best climber in the world, I actually want to be more than that. How easy would it be for me to say, I'm the best in the world at something, and be satisfied with that? Or I could try to be more. These days, Lance Armstrong is not necessarily always the most favored name in cycling. But we don't remember Lance Armstrong because he won 1 Tour de France, or even 2, or even 3, even though stopping there would have still qualified as pretty impressive. We remember him because he kept going beyond what was good enough for everyone else. When I started working with my coach, Dean, he gave me a homework assignment, and he made me read this book that's called The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin. And the book is about, it's this telling of the story of the young chess master, Bobby Fischer. And I'm a big marker up and highlighter of my books. But the one quote in this book that has always, always stuck with me is this. He's talking about his success, and he says, we enjoy the win fully while taking a deep breath. Then exhale, note the lesson learned, and move on to the next adventure. Absolutely, we should honor our successes. Absolutely, we should take pride in the things that we work so hard for. But when they're over, and it's time to move on, we have to let go of those successes if we want to continue to evolve. So it seems clear that we don't want to define ourselves by our past, either successes or failures. So how do we want to move forward? In that pursuit, I encourage you to follow Principle 3. Oops. This is my first ever PowerPoint. Be flexible and imperfect. Flexibility. Flexibility has never been my strongest point. When I was a swimmer growing up, we used to practice starts. And so you're bent over, touching your toes on the block. And my high school swim coach told me that I was the most inflexible girl that he had ever seen in his life. That kind of carried over into my disposition as well. When I came to Whitman, I was not actually a cyclist. I was a swimmer. Now, I wasn't a particularly good swimmer, is the detail that no one actually ever seems to believe. But all through high school, my #1 goal was to qualify for the sectionals meet. So to put this in perspective, my goal was to qualify, not contend, but qualify for a regional meet. And then I came to Whitman, and that goal shifted slightly, and I wanted to qualify for Division III Nationals. And I never did that. And so in the spring of my freshman year, I was a little bit at loose ends because swimming was a seasonal sport, and I never had my sport be seasonal. And so I started racing with the cycling team. And 3 months after I started racing, I not only attended Collegiate Nationals, I won the road race at Collegiate Nationals. So then, no, that was not a climb. I mean, that was not a clap. But then everyone came to me and they said, "Oh, you're a cyclist now." And I said, no, I'm a swimmer. Well, it's probably about time that I introduce you to the sports gods, because they pretty much have a hand in most of the things that happen to me. In this case, the sports gods were willing to cut me a deal. They said, "All right, look, it's not within our power to make you the swimmer that you want to be. But if you go for cycling, we could make you one of the best in the world. How does that sound?" And I said, no, I'm a swimmer. Well, unfortunately, the problem with the sports gods is that they always win. So ultimately, the situation was going to end up with me riding a bike. I actually continue my relationship analogies, and I look on swimming as my first boyfriend. It was the high school love that we just wanted it to get together so badly. We wanted to keep the relationship going, but we realized that we were just growing in different directions. This is the book I'm going to write someday, you guys. It's Relationships for Idiots. I mean, excuse me, athletes. Yeah. So that's the idea of flexibility, being able to follow the cues that I get, even if I don't understand where they're going. Second half of Principle 3 goes a little bit towards perfectionism. And I'm sure that at a school like Whitman, nobody has any knowledge of perfectionism. But just in case you know someone who does, I'm going to tell you some things about it. So I actually have this bizarrely clear memory of standing, and I was waiting in line for something, standing outside of Maxie. And I was thinking to myself, and I've always been a pretty big believer, big problem solver, believer in the power of will. And I started to think to myself, and I said, wow, I have enough good things going on in my life that I don't ever have to have another bad day again. And sure, I'll have bad moments, and bad stuff will happen to me, but I can problem solve that. I can put a positive spin on it, and I don't ever have to have another bad day again. And I thought I was a genius. Unfortunately, I had a couple of things off. Because the reality is that we do have bad days. And frankly, that's not such a bad thing. Some days we'll wake up sad and we don't know why, and it's not a problem. But what I was going for here was the ultimate perfectionism, because I had decided that I could perfect my emotions. The reality is, you carry that attitude for long enough, you have to keep smiling and being happy about everything. How can you solve a problem if you can't admit that the problem exists? The problem with perfectionism is that it's brittle because you can only ever be one thing: perfect. And it goes similar to the idea of success and failure, the idea that you can't have the light without the dark. We all exist in this pulse between the poles, between being perfect and imperfect, between succeeding and between failing. And that's a pulse that's part of life. If we all want to be great, if we want to create something special with our lives, and I think in communities like this, that pretty much goes without saying, it's worth noting that nobody achieves anything without risk. Inherent in the concept of risk is the possibility of failure. That's what the risk is. And so we take these risks, and if we do fail, we admit it, we move on, and we're imperfect. That was again the great gift of the article I did when I was coming back from the eating disorder. Because once everyone in the world knew that I was imperfect, that meant I had the freedom to fail. And having the freedom to fail meant that I had the freedom to try. And so as we move forward down our path, and we're getting bounced in one direction and then in the other, I encourage you to move in a way that is flexible. I encourage you to be blurry, to be messy. Because when we act with, rather than react fearfully against this pulse, that's when we can start to get somewhere. Now, the idea of flexibility is a little bit reactive, because it's reacting to the things that happen to us. So what about the idea of proactively engaging with experience? Towards this end, I encourage you towards Principle 4. Embrace the unexpected. Just run with it. See, the fact is that the sports gods still aren't through teaching me things. And so I'm going to tell a fairly recent story, and I'm going to have to be a little vulnerably honest here. One of the things that I've learned how to do as an athlete is to numb. And that is almost too useful of a tactic, because it means that if I have to go out and do a hard interval workout, I can go out there and numb it out. And all of a sudden, the workout gets a lot easier if you don't have to worry about feeling it. The problem is when you when you don't remember to start feeling again. And that can impact you in your relationships, or even just in noticing how you feel and tapping into yourself. I had someone comment to me, it was a lecture that I saw, about the idea that you can't selectively numb things out. You can't just numb out the bad things and take in the good things. When you get really good at numbing, you just get really good at being numb. So in September, I was at World Championships, and things were going pretty well until, about a lap and a half into a 7-lap race, when I found myself getting unceremoniously woken up from a nap that I was taking in a ditch by a Spanish paramedic, and I got sent to the hospital with a little bit of a concussion. So coming back from that and coming back home, it was a mild injury for what had happened. But my lingering symptoms were that I was really, really tired and really emotionally sensitive, which is actually pretty common with post-concussive syndrome. But I was actually able to give myself the permission to tap in and to see what I needed and to take care of myself, because I guess falling off my bike at 70k an hour was a good enough excuse to pay attention to that kind of a thing. And I talked to a friend later and I said, you know, she asked how I was doing, and I said I actually felt really good. And she asked, what felt so good? And then I had a bit of a genius moment, and I said, feeling. And the reality was that I'd gotten good enough at numbing out that I needed that reminder just to remember to feel. It's another message from the sports gods. Another friend commented on it after hearing this story to say that I should maybe expand the definition to the sports gods mafia, because if you don't listen, you get whacked. Frequently, it's the small or undesired occurrences in our paths that shape the future selves we end up becoming. And sometimes it takes a proverbial crash to carry sufficient force to knock us out of our ingrained habits. I have a good friend who was recently looking for a teaching job, and she walked into an auditorium where all the schools had set up their booths, and she said that there were just hundreds of people there. And there were lines 30 or 40 people deep for every single position. And my friend had been involved in outdoor education, and she was passionate about it, but she decided it was time to look for a real job. And she was looking for a position as an English teacher. And there was one booth that had no line at it. And so she decided, being a little impatient, to just walk up to that booth. And it ended up to be a little school up in Glenwood Springs, which is this gorgeous town up in the mountains in Colorado. And they were looking for a teacher who could be a part-time outdoor education, part-time English teacher. One of my greatest mentors in my life is my yoga teacher, Shannon. And when she was in her early 20s, she was not involved in yoga at all. And in fact, she'd never done it. But at that time, she was diagnosed with cancer. And as part of her recovery, her doctor advised that she start practicing. And from there, she's created a career that I know my life would be in a very, very different place without her. And I know that I am hardly alone in that. So, cancer, concussions, seemingly useless job opportunities. None of these things are what we go looking out for. But all of a sudden, they create the greatest positive shifts in our lives. I sort of like to think of it as looking at the roadblocks instead as deviations that are just taking us in a slightly different direction. So to recap slightly, these first two principles that talk about the past, if we're allowing ourselves to be defined by the past, that holds us back from growth. And 3 and 4, if we aren't following these, that's going to limit the choices that we can take. So that brings us towards principle 5, for those of you who have been keeping track. So this spring I got to go to a race in El Salvador, which is an awesome place to practice being resilient if you're a bike racer. Because you get to deal with things such as the cars that turn into the middle of the bike race and don't seem to notice that there's anything going on, or the race director who sometimes served us dinner but didn't always remember to provide the meals that he was supposed to. And we were staying at this really weird sports hotel that was pretty far away from anything. But you learn to go with it. And that's a day-to-day sense of resilience. But at this race, there was one big stage. And it was sort of, they call it the queen stage of the race. And it was this race that finished with a gigantic climb of a volcano. And so I was talking to Dean on the phone again the night before. And he gave me this piece of advice. And so this is me going into the biggest stage of the race. I'm favored to win the race. And I'm like, Dean, what have you got? And he says, Mara, it's more important to be a good person than a good bike racer. Thanks, coach. But he was right. And he was right enough that it gets to be principle 5. It's more important to be a good person than a good bike racer. Here's what he means. For the bike racer, it means that you and your actions on a day-to-day basis are more valuable than the podiums you stand on. On a larger scale, it means that anyone's career, your accolades, your contact list, they aren't as important as the person that you are when you wake up in the morning. And so who should that person be? I would say that that person should be based on your core values. And core values could be an entire lecture in themselves. But they're things like loyalty, honesty, compassion, love. All of these things are universal goods. We could all agree that they are important. But they're the sort of things that when you listen to this list, you find a couple that stick with you and you say, yeah, for me it's loyalty. Above all things, I want to be loyal. And there's something that's in your heart and you can't really explain it and you don't really have to. You just have to live with them and live by them. Much of my extrinsic motivation has always come from competition. And I recently, at an innocent brunch, my friend Raquel had the question posed to me, what would you be if you couldn't achieve? If going into a situation you could only exist and you couldn't accomplish something. For me, that is almost an existential question. But the fact is, core values aren't based upon achieving. That's fixed. It's either in the past or it's anticipated in the future. Core values are about existence. They are about who you are here, right now, sitting in your seat in Max, the auditorium. And so I'm actually going to modify Principle 5 slightly, just to make it applicable to a broader audience. Live devoted to your core values, because core values are the ultimate tool in resilience. As long as you are clear on them, they will guide you in what you do in the present second. And your action in the present second is really the only thing that you can control. So this is resilience. These are my principles of it. And this is my way of getting to what I would consider to be the greatest contributor to my success as a cyclist. Maybe you think this doesn't apply to you. Maybe you think that you don't need resilience. None of us wants to admit vulnerability. I always used to think that I was absolutely bulletproof because I had insulated myself successfully to a lot of risks. And things I had managed to insulate myself to, I was pretty tough and I could take them. Well, the problem with insulating yourself to risks is you start to limit yourself because you can only do the things that are guaranteed to bring you success. But I was okay with that. I had accepted that because it kept me safe and it kept me secure. For instance, I would train alone. I still train alone all the time. And I go and I ride up into the mountains in Colorado. And we have all these beautiful canyons. And I ride up them sometimes multiple times a day, the same canyon. And so I know them through the seasons. I notice when gravel gets shot onto the road between one day and another. And I know what they look like at all times of the day. It's a sort of ownership. It's relationship with these canyons. I mean, honestly, you talk to a friend and she's worried about the guy who's going to call her or he's not going to call her, and this is a big drama. But for me, the mountains are my best friends. It's pretty bulletproof. Except last fall, we had a little bit of a flood in Colorado. And I don't know if any of you guys heard about this, but it was an absolutely unprecedented weather event. I do not think there was a single person whose home wasn't impacted or whose road wasn't destroyed. 4 people were killed, and the canyons, basically from the yellow line in the road to the other side of the river, was gone. Just the road was gone. It was only a half-sized road anymore. As a result, you were not allowed to ride your bicycle up the canyons because recreationalists were kind of discouraged. At this time, I had also just gotten back from Worlds, and it had been a race that people had been putting a lot of hopes on me for, and I definitely hadn't pulled through. And then we also got news that a good friend in our cycling community in Boulder, Amy Dombrowski, had been killed in a training accident in Belgium. And I needed solace, and I wanted to go to the mountains. And I couldn't. And the reality was that even if your best friends are mountains, you can still get wet. Truly, it is impossible to insulate ourselves to the inherent risk in being human. Nothing is guaranteed except that something is going to happen and that you are going to have the opportunity to react to it. And if nothing is guaranteed, that's why we're going to need resilience. And here's how I would define it in my own working definition. Resilience. It's the ability to constantly and creatively evolve while acting from the deepest convictions of your heart. To live this way is a privilege. It's what allows me to win bike races, and it is what can allow you to win at life. Thank you. And thank you all for making time on your